Okay, before starting, I first would like to thank Anna Maria for organizing this wonderful day. And it's supposed to be a workshop in honor of Gennaro Kerka, but I know her and a lot of us, and it sounds more like a worship of Gennaro Kerka. Anyway, we're going to present here Acquisition Meets Comparison, which is also been published in a book edited by Carlo Cecchetto and Ivano Caponigro, so it's a good occasion also for thanking them for inviting us and other speakers and organizing and editing the book. And in the book there's also Teresa Guasti as one of the authors, so there's a wonderful pictures, and of course there were other people there, but nobody's perfect. Anyway, so we're going to talk here, the plan of the talk, we're going to start by defining what gradable adjectives are, and then very brief sketch the summary about the acquisition of adjectives, very briefly. And then we're going to present 3 experiments we ran in order to test some hypotheses on what happens when kids use and understand adjectives. And then we will try to discuss the results we have in order to draw some conclusion about the semantics of comparison. So this is the plan of today's talk. So let's start briefly by defining gradable adjectives. We're going to use a purely distributional criterion. Gradable adjectives are those adjectives that can enter into comparative constructions and be modified by degree expressions. So what about their interpretations? Well, the most influential view makes some assumptions. The first one is that there are degrees in our ontologies, which are sort of abstract entities. And as a first step, gradable adjectives evoke scales, that is, sets of degrees that are partially ordered along a relevant dimension. So, for instance, a gradable adjective such as tall evokes a scale of height, or full evokes a scale of degrees of fullness. And then when we encounter a sentence such as Leo is tall, this sentence gets analyzed as Leo possesses the tallness property at least to the degree d. So there is a relationship, a function between Leo's height and a degree d. So what is this degree d? Well, the idea is that this degree has to be interpreted, that is, it has to receive a value. And this degree constitutes the standard of comparison. So how is this degree interpreted? How is the standard of comparison fixed? Well, I've been talking about gradable adjectives in general, but there are 2 different kinds of gradable adjectives. There are so-called relative adjectives, things as big, small, tall, short, fast, slow, fat, whatever. And in this case, the value of the standard of comparison needs to be fixed by means of contextual consideration. We need to take into account the context. Typically, we use comparison classes. For instance, a sentence such as Dumbo is big can turn out as true if we compare, if we judge Dumbo big as an animal. So if we take into account the class of comparison of animals. The same sentence is judged to be false if we take into account elephants as class of comparison. Another way is to take into account perceptual considerations. So Bush is tall is true compared to and false compared to Obama. Then there are other adjectives, absolute adjectives such as straight, bent, open, closed, full, empty, which are always gradable because they can enter into comparative constructions and be modified by degree expression. But in this case, it looks like the standard of comparison is not contextually dependent. In a way, it is intrinsic. That is, so, for instance, if we were to judge a sentence like this is closed, this sentence is interpreted as this object as a maximum degree of closeness. Or this is open, this is interpreted as this has at least a minimum degree of openness. And so the idea is that the scale to which close and open projects have intrinsic upper or lower boundary, and this is used as the standard of comparison. The idea is that this standard of comparison is independent from contextual consideration. That is, even if we try to take into account different comparison classes, it shouldn't change. So if this is closed, it's false. It doesn't matter whether it's a fridge door or a drawer. It doesn't matter. And also, even if we take into account perceptual consideration, we shouldn't get a difference. Open means at least some degree of openness. Close means totally close, and it shouldn't change if we take into account two different objects. So summing up, the degree-based approach assumes that gradable adjectives attribute a property to an individual at a degree that exceeds a standard. How do we fix the standard? In case of relative adjectives, the standard has to be contextually retrieved by means of comparison classes or perceptual consideration. But if we have absolute gradable adjectives, the standard of comparison is in a way intrinsic and is equated with the maximum standard or minimum standard of the adjectives. So these were gradable adjectives. What about acquisition of adjectives, even more briefly? The idea is that even if adjectives are, of course, harder to acquire than common nouns, children start producing adjectives by the age of 2. And previous studies show that they're pretty good in interpreting them, at least when they're 3, when the standard of comparison is easily retrievable from the context. That is, children are indeed able to use normative standards when they're presented with a mitten, for instance. They're able to judge it as big or small for being a mitten. So they use normative standards. And they're also able to use perceptual standards. So if they're presented with 2 mittens, they're able to choose the big one or the small one compared to another physically present mitten. But at the same time, children also make a consistent series of errors. They show this extreme labeling behavior. So when they're presented with a series of objects decreasing along relevant dimensions, for instance, 7 objects which go from the biggest one to the smallest one, children tend to label only the extreme item of the series as being big or small, whereas adults tend to judge like the first 3 to be big and the others no. And also they make a consistent series of substitution errors. For instance, children substitute negative terms with a positive antonym. So for instance, they can label a small thing as being big, and they substitute also relevant dimensions. So they might label a tall thing as big. So summing up, when the context clearly provides the intended standard of comparison, the young children have a good performance, but we saw they also make a consistent series of errors. So our first research question was, okay, children are good in interpreting adjectives when the context gives you the standard of comparison, the intended, the contextual standard of comparison. But what happens if we provide a context, we give them an item in which no standard of comparison is clearly retrievable? So you will see later, but our expectation is that if we give them an abstract object, by abstract I mean an object which is not referable to any comparison class. You don't know what that is. And it's presented in isolation, so no other perceptual cues. And then you say, this is big, or this is tall, whatever. The idea is that if the context does not provide a standard of comparison, we expect that subject participants should not be able really to evaluate whether the description applies or not. But if we use an absolute gradable adjectives, participants should use the intrinsic standard, upper or lower boundary. And so they should be able to provide an answer. So we made this first experiment was a truth value judgment task. So for instance, we were presenting that stuff. It was real object, and describe it as this is big. Or we were presenting this object and describe it as this is bent or this is straight in two different lists. And our expected answer, because we had three possible answers, were in the case of this is big, I don't know, I can't tell because no standard of comparison is provided. In the case of that object, if we were to ask this is bent, the expected answer was yes, because it has at least a minimum degree of bentness. But this is straight, the expected answer should be no, because it doesn't reach the maximum degree of straightness. So these are our results in general, but in particular we would like to focus on what happens with absolute and relative adjectives. So first of all, as expected, adults reject, where is it? Reject, red is no. This is straight, refer to this object, and accept, this is bent, right. So this is expected. On the contrary, younger children tend to accept, have a high rate of acceptance for this is straight, okay? And in a way, we can also see a sort of developmental trend in the rate of acceptance. This is for absolute adjectives. And these are the results for relative adjectives. So something like this is big or small. We're plotting together positive and negative antonyms. And as you can see, adults did tend to answer, I can't tell. So this is big, well, I don't know, more than 60%. And this is what we expected. But quite surprisingly, younger children, these are the 3 years olds, have a very high rate of acceptance. So you say, this is big, and they say, yes. This is small, and they say, yes. Very high, over 80%, even if the standard of comparison was not retrievable. And even more clearly, we can see a developmental trend also in this case, in which 5 years old seem to lie in the between. So how to account for these facts, in particular for this very high acceptance rate for relative adjectives? We try to entertain some simple hypotheses, but we excluded that children simply don't know the meaning of the adjectives. We have reason to do that, but I'm going to skip them. And we also excluded that they're just being over-charitable. Like, I don't know what to say, just say yes. Because also in this case, we have evidence. So we tried to come up with another explanation for this surprising behavior. And we tried to build on a suggestion that was put on by Clark back in the 70s. And he was starting to notice that if you take Silvio is 163 centimeters tall, or Silvio is tall, in these cases, you see tall, right, in both cases. But in the first sentence, tall doesn't mean taller than a standard, really tall. It simply serves as to indicate that we're talking about vertical dimension. It's very neutral in this sense. only in the second sentence, Silvio is tall, here you can find the meaning Silvio is taller than a standard, and it should be false anyway. So our hypothesis is that children start by assigning this minimal, nominal-like interpretation, the one you see here, to relative and also absolute in a way, but we're going to talk mainly about relative adjectives. So our idea is that children start interpreting big as it has an extension, or tall, this has vertical dimension. And only at a later stage, they would switch to the adult-like, more informative, comparative reading, tall meaning taller than a standard. So first, minimal reading, this is tall, this has a vertical dimension. And then, at a later stage, switch to the more informative comparative reading. This is tall, meaning this is taller than a contextual standard.
Okay, let's see, it works, yeah. So starting from this observation, we build on a parallelism with a well-known phenomenon that is scalar implicatures and acquisition of adjectives. In this sense, as Francesca just told you, we can hypothesize that relative GAs and in general gradable adjectives have this minimal and enriched meaning, and this resembles a lot what happens for scalar items, in which we can individuate the logical meaning and the pragmatic or enriched meaning, right? And so, drawing on this parallelism, we can see that for adjectives, just like younger children accepted this is tall or this is big, as we have seen in experiment 1, while adults don't, and we have seen a developmental trend in this. For scalar implicatures, it has been found that younger children tend to accept under-informative uses of scalar terms, whereas older children and adults don't. In a series of experiments that me and Teresa and Gennaro ran some years ago, using the true value judgment task with scalar items, what we found is that in a situation in which, for example, Baloo has some stuff, some objects there, some trash has been, and then he closes all of them, if the puppet describes that situation as saying, okay, Baloo closed some of his trash cans, what happens is that typically 4- and 5-year-old children accept the under-informative statements mostly half percent of the times, or better, half of the children at age 4 or 5 accept that under-informative statement, while older children from 6 on and adults typically don't. So you see, again, this very clear developmental trend for scalar implicatures too in a true value judgment task. And another way to explore this parallelism is that just like younger children have an adult-like performance when the standard of comparison is explicitly provided, as we have seen from Francesca, in scalar implicatures, again, when younger children are presented with both scalar items, with both alternatives, for example, some and all, they do not have any hesitation in choosing the most informative one. That's a felicity judgment task, back to Kirk et al. 2001, in which the same situation, for example, a situation in which 5 squirrels are doing this, 5 chipmunks are taking a shower, and you have 2 puppets describing the same situation. One says, all the chipmunks are taking a shower, and the other says, some of the chipmunks are taking a shower. This very same children tested with the true value judgment task did have no hesitation to select the correct alternative with all, the one with the most informative quantifier. So this might resemble something that we have heard before from Dave Barner. Again, they have no hesitation. If the 2 alternatives are there, they just go for the right one. But if the 2 alternatives are not there, directly available, then they stick to the underformative side of the meaning. So to explore, this parallelism further, we conducted 2 more experiments to see, if we can build on this. In experiment 2 in particular, we tested only adults and see if we can turn adults into children, making adults accepting this minimal meaning and accepting it. And in experiment 3, we tested children's pragmatic tolerance, building on a work by Katsas and Bishop 2011. So in the second experiment, we tried to see if we could detect this minimal nominal-like interpretation in adults. How do we did that? We used a binary true value judgment task, and we tested adults and provided them a specific training, asking them to be tolerant with respect to underinformative statements. So we gave them a training with scalar implicatures and asked them to accept underinformative uses to see if this translates also to underinformative nominal-like interpretation of relative adjectives, for example. And what we showed, again, objects, abstract objects in isolation. We had a video in this case with adults. In 2 lists, we labeled these things as this is tall or this is short, or this is bent and this is straight. We had plenty of this stuff. Crucially, we had true and false controls, but also we had what we call not applicable controls, in which exactly the adjectives used could not apply to any cases to that, in any circumstances to that object. So this is vegetarian, cannot apply in any. Just to check that, okay, they were trained to be tolerant, but still they should not accept crazy uses of adjectives. So we wanted them to say no to that. And in fact, what we found is that adults' acceptance rate was above 80% in case of relative adjectives here. And surprisingly, around 50% also in case of absolute. So things like this is straight was judged as true in that condition, the minimally bent object, actually. And as we expected, they didn't perform a chance or randomly in these controls in which the adjective actually did not apply. So what we found is that if informative was left aside for a while and we asked adults to be tolerant, well, adults pattern just like children, accepting a description with a relative adjective and also with absolute adjective, as in fact children did in our first experiment. So in fact, we kind of detected this minimal nominal-like interpretation of gradable adjectives in adults too. And what we did is explore this further by testing pragmatic tolerance. There was a work by Katsas and Bishop in 2011 testing kids on how they could explain for these underinformative over-acceptance of underinformative statements by kids in case of scalar implicatures. Well, to draw with the parallelism, we might think that children's behavior in experiment 1, in which they over-accepted relative adjectives, might be explainable in terms of pragmatic tolerance. And so we find a way to detect if that was the case. And this is what we did. This is what we did in our third experiment. First, let me show you what Katsas and Bishop did. Okay, this is a standard true value judgment task in which the same rationale as before applies. What did the mouse pick up? The mouse picked up some of the carrots. Okay, so as we said, children typically accept this, over-accept this, while adults don't. But crucially, the same scenario, if you ask them to provide reward to the puppet and give them 3 choices, so a small strawberry for very bad description, a big strawberry for very optimal description, and a medium-sized strawberry for things that are good enough. Well, what they found is that children and adults pattern alike, and in fact, in case of underinformative scalar terms, they tend to use the medium-sized strawberry. So we applied the same paradigm to The very same material we used in experiment 2, we used that in experiment 3. Simply, we provided them with three candies of different size and asked them to reward the puppet accordingly as soon as to judge their description of the puppet accordingly. In this case, we had under informative controls to control for the correct use or expected use of this medium-sized candy. And for example, we gave under informative description like this. This is a piece of cutlery. We expected them to use the medium-sized candy because it's true but not optimal. No. And in fact, what we found is that in these controls, children and adults performed perfectly. So what do they do with relative and absolute gradable adjectives? These are the results by children. As you see, they used the medium-sized candy a lot. These are 5-year-old children. And so you see that the trend, well, it's actually 3 to 5-year-old children. It's pretty mixed. But certainly, there's a difference with experiment 1. And okay, and despite the fact that the objects used were exactly the same in the 2 experiments. This is a pattern with absolute, as you can see, even here, there's not really a difference between relative and absolute adjectives. They tend to accept an almost empty bottle as good enough if it is described as full or empty, or as light open box as closed or open. I mean, they tend to accept these things. Quite interesting. In fact, there's no statistical difference between relative and absolute adjectives in children. But of course, there is, they perform very nicely on true and false controls. So again, this is the controls. Oh, okay, it goes like this. Okay. No, we'll skip that because it's, okay, these are adults' results, and you can see they pattern just like children, except there is a slight higher tendency to, in adults, I mean, there are more categorical answers in adults, but still the trend is nice here. They use the medium-sized candy a lot. Okay. So the general discussion, the conclusion about experiment 3 is that both children and adults opt for the medium-sized candy to evaluate the appropriateness of relative and also absolute gradable adjectives, even if the standard of comparison was not directly retrievable, because, as we said, we use absurd object in isolation. So the description actually is evaluated as true, even though not optimal. So taking stock on these 3 experiments that we ran, we can say we have seen that in experiment 1, children actually overwhelmingly accepted this description, even in the absence of a standard of comparison. And this led us to hypothesize that children start by assigning a minimal interpretation to gradable adjectives and then move to a more informative, comparative-like meaning. And they do so when they start understanding that informativeness is at stake. And this is the parallelism with scalar implicature. So to explore this parallelism further, in experiment 2, we tried to set aside informativeness and tested adults. And we managed actually to turn adults into children, making them accepting this really under-informative description with relative adjectives. And what we did in experiment 3 is exactly testing children and adults to see if, in fact, their children's over-acceptance of this kind of description in experiment 1 was due to a sort of pragmatic tolerance that was also detected in case of scalar implicatures. Do you want to conclude? How much time do we have? I have no idea. I haven't seen the sign.
Now, okay, because I promised you also to say something about what these results could tell us about semantics of comparison, but this is going to get really speculative in a way. So the idea is that very, very briefly, I presented I presented the most influential view, the degree-based semantics, but in a way, in the degree-based semantics, the first assumption is that there are degrees in the ontology, and in a way that the notion of abstract entities ordered along a scale, in a way, is primitive, right? But if we see this data, in a way, is somehow strange, because, of course, we could account for children's data. Tall meaning has at least a minimum degree of tallness. It's like we could rephrase the minimal interpretation also in these terms in the degree-based semantics. But in a way, we think that there's also another approach to adjectives in general, partial function analysis, which is also being well, okay, there are people talking about this later. And the idea, in a way, well, it's going to be a little bit complicated, but is that all adjectives behave alike, and this should be easier also for children that are acquiring language. And that the first step in understanding the meaning of an adjective is to identify the intended domain of comparison. So tall, we're talking about trees, we're talking about 5 years old, or we're talking about men or whatever. And then within that domain, tall identifies a subset. So this is Barbara Parti idea that relative adjectives are subsective adjectives which identify a subset within that comparison class. So in a way, we think that within this approach, it should be easier to account for the data, the data we found, and also could be more compatible with acquisition steps. So, but this is just, in a way, just to give you a hint. So let's get to the last slide, which is very... Okay, thank you. Okay, I should change it now.
This is cool. So one thing that Katsos, I think, convinced us of, and really a lot of the work in the scalar implicature literature convinces us of, is the fact that these binary tasks that involve a yes or no judgment probably don't tell us enough about what kids know. And the problem is in psychology is that that's true outside of the domain of pragmatics as well. And so it becomes difficult to determine when it's the case that we're learning something by these failures and when we're not. So it could be the case that what you've showed is that the difference here is related to pragmatic tolerance. But I suspect if you did a study that has no relation at all to pragmatics, you would find the same type of behavior. And so this is found throughout psychology. If you ask kids a yes-no question and they have any degree of uncertainty about what it is you're asking, or there's a presupposition failure or something, they have a tendency to say yes in many contexts. And so it could just be that you've identified one task that's much more sensitive to kids' knowledge relative to another. Now you can characterize that in terms of tolerance, as Katsos did, but then I guess the work is to figure out what that precisely means and how to differentiate it from uncertainty. So in the case of Katsos, his tasks, you have kids choosing a middle value, which is consistent with them behaving like adults, but it's also consistent with them not knowing what you're asking. And so the safest bet, if you have no idea in that task, is to go in the middle, right? And so part of that is to try to figure out, well, what might change in kids as they become, as their sort of tolerance changes, what might cause that difference in tolerance, so that you could make predictions about how the behavior on that task will change. And I think that's what's remaining in the Katsos picture, at least, and perhaps here.
Okay, I think two things. This was our first guess, in a way. But then we saw the data because, okay, the first experiment we ran was a ternary judgment task, right? Because we have yes, no, or I don't know, I can't tell. But children, not even 5 years old, were opting for I don't know. And this was a sort of epistemic right? Also, in the training session, of course, we didn't use adjectives. But we were presenting situations in which there were no contextual cues to judge whether the description was appropriate. So for instance, there was a kid with a very big hat, covering all of his head, and we were saying, this is blonde. And say, well, no, I don't know. So it was really epistemic uncertainty. And kids were not using that option. Well, adults did, right? But we had some controls in our experiments, which was meant to prompt I don't know answer. So for instance, there was a zebra toy, which was described as this is obedient, or a Playmobil, and it was he's married, right? And so adults went for I don't know. But kids did not simply accept. They just split. Half of them say yes, and half of them say no. But 50% of them, they didn't know, they didn't have any cues to say no, but they did say no. So in a way, of course, this was a simple hypothesis. Well, when they don't have enough cues, they just say yes. But in our control items, they were just 50-50, like chance.
I had the same experience where you can spend a half an hour training, they can say I don't know, and they won't say it. I mean, it's just like they don't want it, they don't want to say that.
Yeah, but here, with our third experiment, they were indeed using the medium size. So probably they interpret it in another way. So yes, I know, but it's more or less. So in a way, I think it's, yeah, that was sort of answer. So it's not to just say yes, always. When they don't have any good reason to say no, they say yes. Because in that case, it was really chance. Have 50% yes, but 50% no.
The point isn't that they have a yes bias. It's just that, you know, we've shown, I think, convincingly, there's a problem with this type of task where it depends on the kid. In some, you know, in this case, saying I don't know. And so maybe what you've shown is that this other type of task where you give them the alternative responses laid out, as you have, like, you know, in different levels of reward or having different puppets say the different experiences, kids are much more likely to exhibit knowledge in those types of tasks relative to one like the first one. And so the real question is just, well, you know, you can interpret that in different ways. And the question is, what's the motivation for saying that this has to be tolerant per se?
Well, pretty sure. I mean, there are some cases in which we dubbed I don't know, also in the first experiment, but which were not really I don't know. So for instance, we were presenting with this minimally bent rope, and then they would say, this is straight. Yes, no, or I don't know. And they were like, well, here it is straight, and here it's not, right? They couldn't choose. They couldn't just give a simple answer. And in a way, this reminded us of what you were just saying, right, about rabbits. In a way, it looks like they have a sort of a necessary condition. So in a way, our minimal interpretation could be maybe, I don't know, because I'm really slow, I have to think about it, rephrased in terms of necessary condition to fall under the extension of what is straight. I mean, ropes can be straight, but probably, I don't know, clouds cannot. So this is a sort of necessary condition, but not yet sufficient. So straighter than standard or whatever. So they were not able, if you force them to, this is straight, well, here it is, and here it's not. This is full. Well, here it's full, here it's not. So, strange behavior.
Yeah, I have a question concerning the availability of a weak interpretation. Yeah, so I think your own experiments show that the kids at least have available a weak or minimal interpretation. But then the first finding you mentioned from the literature, I think, that, you know, when you give them like a range of things and they only say about the tallest thing that it's tall and only they say about the shortest that it's short, I think this becomes rather more puzzling, because there it looks like they apply an especially strong interpretation. And so I was just wondering if you had any ideas about what goes on there.
Well, the idea about extreme labeling is really strange. So there was this paper about, I think you should know it because it quoted high and low, and so extreme labeling goes both ways. So there are kids, so if you present them with a series of 7 objects, who just label big the first one and say no to the other 6. And there are kids, same age, which labels big the first 6, and then just say no to the last one. So extreme labeling goes both ways. So there was this paper in which they just put the individual performances of kids, because it was in a way weird to collapse that all together. So our idea is that, okay, you have the domain, we're talking about these 7 objects, and in a way they're struggling to find the standard of comparison. So how if you have all of them, if you have 7 or 9 or whatever, then you know that the first one must be adjective and the last one doesn't have to be. I mean, it's not. But then they really don't know. So you see that adults really drop around the mid of the series. Whereas kids, sometimes they just drop the second one, but sometimes they drop at the last one. And so, and this is also for absolute adjectives. So you find different things.
Yeah, so I was wondering about the minimal condition for something to be big or small or tall, etc. So I would kind of agree that this is what is the source of that kind of results. So when they see this kind of object and there is no comparison class and it is described this is big, they will say yes. However, I think that saying that this is because, okay, it has dimensions, or so it could be big by its nature, it's a little bit too far-fetched. So what my interpretation would be that perhaps they could think that there is some sense that it could be big. Let's say a comparison class in which this object counts as big. Because imagine that you have kind of radical example, like for the straight adjective. So you have something that is completely bent, and you still describe it as this is straight. I don't know if you have data on that, but I would guess that no one, not even children, would agree that this is straight, because it somehow falls out of the kind of extension, yeah, for this vague predicate. And so in my judgment, this is there is this kind of minimal meaning here, but it's not just about the applicability of the adjective, because this is how I understood your point.
Okay, so we haven't talked about it, but in the first experiment, we also have a scalar judgment task as a second part. So for instance, we were presenting kids and adults with 7 objects. So for instance, we have 7 ropes. So the first one was completely straight, and then we have the one we tested here, so minimally bent, and then it went more bent and more bent and more bent. And so I don't know whether you have it. And this was one of the cases in which kids, but even 5 years old, so for instance, we were presenting the almost like this, but still, if they could see even a small part which was straight, they were saying here, it's not all of them, okay? There were some kids who like correctly said, so this is relative, you don't have absolute right. So this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So you could see that with, okay, imagine adults, right? So this is completely straight, and adults were here, yes, and then boom, like this, right? No to the other 6. And then there were kids who were like this, but then there were kids who also here, the 6, if there was a straight part, they would say, this is straight, here it's straight, here it's not. So they couldn't just say yes or no. But they weren't really confident saying no. So in a way, we're trying to explore also data with absolute adjectives. So because our first guess, it was that there was only with relative. But also in our last experiment, kids treat in the same way relative and absolute adjectives, going for the medium size, even for absolute. So we had a bottle which was really almost empty. We were saying this is full, and they will give the medium size. Okay, this bottle, this is full, medium size, not adult. So, I hope they wouldn't.
No, I'll ask in the question period or later. Yeah, it's fine.
Okay.